with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The LeaderEdge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. As always, thank you for checking in. Episode 250. Got something special for you today. Had two longtime listeners, Dr. Adrian Isabella and Isaacson. They reached out. They said, hey, we would like to synthesize your top 10 most popular episodes of all time. I said, that'd be cool. And then they said, we'd also like to, because they're fans of adult development, we'd also like to dive in a little bit deep and kind of make sense of 10 of the most popular adult development episodes, because I've done a whole series on that topic. So I said, sure. So you know what? I'm going to turn it over to them, and they're going to take you on a little bit of an adventure. And then, of course, I'll be back with you at the end to help debrief this experience. Let's jump right in to the conversation between Adrian and Alan. It's pretty fascinating. Enjoy.
Okay, leadership, always a hot topic, right?
It is. And here's the twist. We're ditching those typical, climb the ladder leadership books. We're going way beyond that.
Oh, I like where this is going. So what are we diving into instead?
So we've got a whole stack of research here. Academic articles, interviews with some seriously insightful people, even some wisdom from, get this, a Jesuit priest.
Wow. Okay, you weren't kidding about going deep. I'm intrigued. What's the big question we're tackling with all this?
The big question is leadership really just about those fancy job titles? CEO, manager, head honcho, that sort of thing.
I see. Yeah, that old assumption. Like you only count as a leader if you've got the official label. But is that really true? Because from those interviews, especially the ones with Day and Riggio, it seems like that's a pretty limited view.
Totally. It's like saying only the conductor leads an orchestra.
Exactly. What about the musicians themselves? Years of practice, the way they harmonize, how they respond to each other. It's so much bigger than just one person.
And Chalif, in his interview with Fabiano, puts it perfectly. He says, leaders and followers form an action circle around a common purpose.
It's not a hierarchy, it's a dynamic exchange, right?
Absolutely.
And it makes you think about leadership in a whole new light. Take Day's story of the CEO who lost his entire team in the 9/11 attacks. Rebuilding the company was obviously a huge challenge, but rebuilding those relationships, that shared sense of purpose, that's where the real leadership challenge was.
And it wasn't about his title in that situation, was it? It was about connection, trust, the really hard work of putting the pieces back together.
Exactly. So if that's leadership, how often are we just waiting around for someone else to lead when we could be stepping up right now, wherever we are?
Like Alan says in the Heifetz interview, what if we only taught one partner in a tango? It makes you realize how much we focus on the leader and forget that everyone else is part of the dance.
It takes two to tango, after all. So if leadership isn't about the title, then what is it really about? How do we get better at it, regardless of our official role? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's save that for the next part of our deep dive. But then how do we become better leaders throughout our lives? What goes into developing those skills, regardless of what our job title says or doesn't say?
One thing that often gets overlooked is practice.
Practice.
Yeah. It sounds, I don't know, almost too simple. But Day really emphasizes how important deliberate practice is.
Deliberate practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's not just talking about adulthood here. He suggests we can actually start nurturing leadership skills in childhood.
Childhood. Wow.
Yeah. Think about it. You don't just wake up one morning as a star athlete or a musical virtuoso.
Years of piano lessons.
Exactly. It takes years of dedicated practice, of pushing yourself, learning from mistakes.
And leadership's no different.
Exactly. Riggio and Murphy actually have a term for this. They call it the long lens view on development. We need to ditch this idea that leadership is like a one and done workshop you go to.
Yeah, right.
It's a lifelong journey of growth, of learning. It's not about cramming for some leadership exam. It's about consistently showing up, building those muscles over time.
Okay, so it's a journey, but it's not always like a suit and tie journey, right? Because we were talking about childhood earlier.
Yeah. And actually, Alan's comment about parenting being a leadership role really resonated with me there.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Because think about it. It's constant communication. It's influencing those little humans.
And a fair bit of crisis management.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's in those moments, those everyday leadership moments, that we grow. Coaching a sports team, organizing a neighborhood project, those are all valuable experiences. And it's about recognizing them, realizing that leadership isn't confined to the boardroom.
So we need to be more aware of those moments.
Yes, actively engage with them. And just like with any skill, our understanding of leadership, it evolves over time too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And this is where that overview of Keegan's stages of adult development from Reams comes in. It's fascinating, really, because people at different stages, they interpret leadership differently, they practice it differently.
Oh, that's so interesting.
It is. Think about your own journey with leadership, right? How has your understanding of it evolved? What experiences have shaped your perspective? It's Keegan's theory in action.
Who's leading who, and how do I even define leadership at different points in my life? And
Exactly. And how do those definitions impact the way we interact with others, who we choose to follow, how we choose to lead?
which takes us to a really crucial point that often gets overshadowed when we talk about leadership. With all this talk about leaders and developing leadership skills, something struck me as kind of, well, odd. We rarely talk about the other half of the equation.
It's the other half.
Yeah, the followers. Both Riggio and Fabiano pointed it out, and it just got me thinking.
It's true. It's like we're so focused on the conductor that we forget about the orchestra.
Exactly. And that's a problem, right? Because
Yeah.
it ignores this whole set of dynamics that are essential to how leadership actually works.
Absolutely. In the real world. Yeah.
And ignoring the followers, it can have some pretty, I don't know, concerning consequences.
How so?
Well, Riggio even asks, why do people follow bad leaders?
Oh, that's a good question. A big one.
Yeah. It's a question that goes way beyond just charisma or even fear.
Right. It's deeper than that.
It gets at something much deeper. It's like these unspoken beliefs we have about what a leader should be like.
Oh, interesting. You mean like implicit leadership theories?
Yeah, exactly. And those beliefs, they can sometimes lead people to follow those my way or the highway types, even when it's clearly not in their best interest.
Wow. So you're saying there are times when people are actually drawn to those domineering leaders,
Yeah.
even tyrannical ones.
It seems counterintuitive, right?
It does.
But it seems like it taps into this deep-seated human need for certainty, for someone to just make the tough calls, especially in times of chaos or uncertainty.
That makes sense.
And this is where Kellerman's work gets really interesting, because she argues that followers can sometimes be more dangerous than the leaders themselves.
Whoa, hold on. Followers being more dangerous. How so?
Because they're the ones who enabled the destructive behavior. A leader without followers is just someone shouting into the void.
Oh, that's a powerful image.
It's the followers who give the leader power, who carry out the directives, who often become complicit.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. And it reminds me of that story Riggio told about his conversation with a public defender who worked with gangs. What's considered leadership in that world often looks very different from, a business setting.
Oh, so.
It's about enforcing a strict code, demanding loyalty, sometimes even resorting to ruthlessness.
Wow. It really challenges our whole conception of what leadership should look like.
It does. And it made me realize that becoming a better follower is just as important as developing strong leaders.
100%. And that's where that idea of courageous followership comes in, right?
Yes, from Chalif. It's about being an active participant, not just a passive bystander. asking the tough questions, holding leaders accountable.
Even when, maybe especially when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's about shifting our mindset from follow the leader to follow your conscience.
I like that.
And thinking about courageous followership, it made me think about Day's point about leadership development. He makes this crucial distinction between developing individual leaders, which of course is important, but also about developing a capacity for leadership within entire systems.
Oh, I like that. So it's not just about cultivating a single plant, but like nurturing the whole garden.
Yes, you need both. And it made me think about that model from Kellerman. You can't separate the leader, the follower, and the context, the situation they're in. They're all intertwined.
It's like that old saying, it takes a village.
Right. And this is where Wheatley and Allen's work on Indigenous leadership offers such a powerful perspective.
Yeah. What did they say again?
They talk about community as the container for leadership. It's not just about a group of individuals. It's about shared responsibility, about leadership emerging organically from the needs and the aspirations of the group.
So it's less about creating superstars and more about, like you said, cultivating those environments where leadership can just flourish at all levels.
Exactly. And that brings us to our final thought-provoking question for everyone listening. How can we shift our thinking from developing individual leaders to developing that capacity for leadership within entire communities, entire organizations? What would that even look like? In your world, in your sphere of influence?
That's a big question.
It is. And it's one worth exploring further, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Okay, so how about we now do a deep dive into adult development, which, fair warning, sounds a lot drier than it actually is once you get into it. And what's amazing is how much this field had to fight to even be taken seriously. We're talking sneaking research into companies because the higher-ups thought it was too out there.
Seriously, like they were undercover agents of leadership development or something? What were people so afraid of?
It challenged the whole freaking narrative, right? The idea that leadership is all about charisma and skills. Adult development says, hold on, there's a whole deeper level.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
It's about how a leader makes sense of the world, their center of gravity, so to speak, like their default mode for understanding their role, for making decisions. It impacts everything.
So not just climbing the ladder, but like expanding your capacity to handle whatever comes your way.
Exactly. And get this, research has found that a leader's stage of development...
Oh, wait, hold on. You can actually measure development, like put a number on something so complex.
That's the wild part. There are ways to assess it, and studies show it's the single most accurate predictor of a leader's effectiveness. Not their personality, not their skills, but how their inner world is wired.
You're blowing my mind right now. So we're not just talking about some abstract personal growth here. This has real implications.
Huge implications for how organizations develop their leaders, for how teams function. Because if all we focus on is the technical stuff, the skills...
We're missing the operating system underneath it all.
Exactly. Imagine trying to run some complex app on a 10-year-old phone. It's going to be slow, glitchy, might even crash the whole system.
Ooh, I've worked with a few leaders like that.
Yeah.
But before we go there, let's back up. When we say adult development, what do we actually mean? There are all these models, Keegan, Torbert. It gets confusing.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the weeds. The key thing to remember is it's not about ranking people, saying one stage is better than another.
Okay, so then what is it about?
It's recognizing that as we mature, our capacity to handle complexity, to hold multiple perspectives, to lead through ambiguity, it evolves.
So it's less about reaching some final destination, more about the ongoing journey of growth.
Now you're getting it. And that journey, it's a fascinating one.
Okay, you've got my attention. Tell me more about this journey. What makes it so fascinating?
One of the most interesting things is how much it thrives on discomfort.
Wait, discomfort? That's a good thing for development. That wasn't exactly in the business books I read.
It sounds counterintuitive, right? But think of it like, physical exercise. You don't build muscle by staying comfy on the couch.
You got to push your limits a bit, embrace the burn.
Exactly. And adult development, it's kind of similar. You need some healthy stress, some carefully calibrated challenges to really grow.
Okay, constructive discomfort, not just chaos. But how do you actually do that in a leadership development context?
Oh, man, so many ways. But one story that always stands out is this leadership team. They were struggling, infighting, no trust.
Sounds familiar.
So their consultant, total genius move, takes them to the Museum of Tolerance.
Whoa. Talk about shaking things up, heavy stuff.
Exactly. It forced them out of their comfort zones, got them thinking about the world in completely different ways.
Did it work?
Oh, yeah, big time. That shared experience of disorientation, but in a safe space, it allowed them to rebuild trust, come back together as a more cohesive unit.
Okay, that's powerful stuff. So it's not just about understanding these stages, it's about creating experiences that really shift people.
And that's where techniques like the snowman come in.
The snowman.
Yeah, it's this tool consultants use to help teams visualize their collective development. Each snowball is like a different stage, with the size representing strengths and growth areas.
I like that. Simple but effective. So instead of just talking about improving teamwork, you can actually see where you're at.
Exactly. Speaking of seeing it in action, remember that leadership program you mentioned with the micro experiences?
Yes, the one where, was it Home Depot, tried out new behaviors in these small, low-risk settings?
Yes, the drip method, they called it.
Yeah.
Little bites of learning that added up to big changes over time.
Like learning a new language, right? You don't just memorize the dictionary. You got to immerse yourself.
Exactly. And that peer feedback. Crucial. It's not just a boss saying, do this. It's colleagues challenging and supporting each other's growth.
Powerful. So we've got this framework. We've got tools. Why isn't this more mainstream? It seems like the secret's out.
You'd think so. Part of it, I think, is the whole measurement thing, especially with collective development. We've got good tools for individuals, but...
How do you measure a whole team stage?
Exactly. It's like way more complex than just adding up individual scores. Plus, our own stage influences how we perceive others.
Oh, interesting. So someone at a more conventional stage might not even recognize the signs of someone at a post-conventional level.
Totally. Different yardsticks, you know? It's fascinating, really. And it just highlights how much adult development isn't just some theory. It's this real messy human thing.
So it's like we've got these different lenses and we're all walking around looking through our own, trying to make sense of everyone else.
And that's exactly why understanding these stages is so powerful. It's not about labeling people. It's about getting where they're coming from, you know?
Literally. But how do we actually use this stuff to become better leaders? Like, where do we even begin?
Honestly, start with yourself. Where are you on this developmental map? What are your strengths? What are those edges? You could stand to grow a bit.
Ooh, good point. I like that.
Yeah.
So some introspection is in order.
Exactly. And think about the leaders you've admired. What was it about them? Were they embodying these principles without even realizing it?
Oh, that's interesting. And what about the opposite? The leaders who maybe didn't bring out the best in us.
Those can be super insightful too. Maybe they were operating from a different stage with totally different priorities.
Instead of just getting frustrated, we can start to see those interactions through this new lens.
Exactly. Compassion and understanding, even. It's not about letting anyone off the hook, but it can help us make sense of things.
Totally. We're all just out here doing our best with the tools we've got at any given moment.
And some of us have had more opportunity to upgrade those tools, right? That's part of what we're talking about here.
Adult development, it's not just some theoretical thing. It's got real practical implications for how we lead, how we work together.
And ultimately how we create organizations that are actually humane.
Organizations that support growth, not just in profits, but in their people.
100%. Because when people feel seen, heard, supported in their growth, that's when the real magic happens.
That's when innovation happens, creativity, true collaboration.
And isn't that what it's all about? Creating a world where everyone has the chance to thrive, to reach their full potential.
Man, I love that vision. So much better than just climbing a ladder, right?
This is about something bigger. It's about evolving as humans together.
And on that note, I think we'll leave our listeners to ponder that for a bit. A huge thank you to you. This has been eye-opening.
My pleasure, truly. Always happy to geek out about adult development, especially with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's giving you a lot to think about.
Okay. I want to thank our two guest hosts, and I am here with a guest. He's a returning member of the podcast. I believe this is his third time. Just an incredible thinker. Gary Lloyd, his bio is in the show notes, so you can look at that and some of his adventures, some important links. But Gary, why don't you bring listeners into our little secret here?
A little secret is that conversation was entirely generated by AI. What we did was we loaded up transcripts of the top 10 podcasts and then 10 on adult development. And that whole conversation with all of the intonation and variation of voice and a summary pretty good high level. What did you think of the summary, Scott?
I mean, I was blown away. I mean, there's a couple things that are just not totally accurate, but generally speaking, Gary, it was amazing. It was if two people were having a conversation and making sense of how they took in the transcripts or how they took in the podcast episodes. It was just amazing.
I mean, I loaded up my book and got a similar sense out of it. It was very good, and apparently it can read at the moment about 500,000 words. It's quite a lot of words that can be just loaded up. And I think one of the things that it illustrates is how the context is changing.
Yes.
And how it's changing so quickly. And I think with what were probably misnamed as large language models, people thought would reach the peak with ChatGPT and incremental improvements. We're really in the early days, in the age of steam when it comes to AI. We don't even have passenger trains yet. Maybe we've just got passenger trains. We don't yet have spinning jennies. We certainly don't have hedge trimmers and leaf blowers.
It's mind-boggling. I had seen your LinkedIn post where you had uploaded a portion of your book, right? And again, for listeners, a link to Gary's book is in the show notes. But you essentially uploaded the text, and then the AI literally creates a conversation and then has a conversation about the book. And you were just telling me even before we started recording about some things that they're talking about that are about to happen. It's moving so quickly. What are those new innovations that they're saying are coming up?
So I saw a podcast with Stephen Johnson, who's an author, writes for the New York Times. He's written 12 books, and he was recruited in by Google to create this tool. And what Stephen said was that within the coming months, we'll see multilingual. I presume that's two ways, from sources to voice, and choose the output voice you want. And then mind-blowingly, this really would be mind-blowingly, is that you can join the two podcast hosts and talk to them.
Maybe episode 300 will be me talking with two fictitious guests who have consumed literally the library of phronesis.
Yeah, I think at this point, Scott, we have to ask ourselves, are we really here?
We are. At least I think I am.
Just going back to the steam engine thing, I think there are two things going on. I mean, I think the big message here is we climb up onto the balcony. The context is changing. The context is an ecosystem in its own right, and it's going to continue changing at this rapid pace for like the next, we don't know, but I would say 10 years. There are two elements, the engines, and then there are the uses of those engines.
Yes.
And the engines are still evolving very quickly. And we've seen a lot of that just in the last week. So the environment in which people are leading is changing very quickly. So what does it mean to leading in this environment? What does it mean for the skills that leaders need? What does it mean for leading teams that are equipped with AI? How does that change? What skills do they need?
Yes.
How do we develop all of those? How do we make strategy in this?
Exactly. I think for me, the practical wisdom is there was an interesting article. I included this quote in an article I wrote called On the Cutting Edge or the Chopping Block. And it was really about the future of management education and the need for us to start having conversations like this in management education. Because if I'm leading a team who's using these AI-enabled tools, I have to be what they called in the Deloitte review, tech fluent, which is, this was their quote from the article, all workers from executives to interns will need to learn much more about critical systems, their capabilities and their adjacencies, their strategic and operational value, and the particular possibilities they enable. In other words, individuals will need to become tech fluent. Not that the C-level individuals need to know how to code, but they need to understand, especially to your point, if we're doing strategy, because very, very quickly, tech is moving from a silo in an organization of the person who set up your computer to becoming core to almost every business strategy. And if you aren't tech fluent, if you don't understand the opportunities potentially that some of these innovations provide, because we're going to see whole new business models. I mean, I almost, in my mind, I see when some of the platform business models were introduced, for instance, where you have an Airbnb and you have an Uber and it's a platform. And now we have the world's largest people moving service or the world's largest lodging service, and you own no real estate or vehicles. There's just going to be all kinds of opportunities that we're going to see. And if you aren't tech fluent, from a leadership standpoint, I think you're going to get disrupted very quickly. Wouldn't you agree?
I think people are already missing the point. I loaded up onto the tool that generates the podcast, amongst other things. And by the way, listeners, it's a fantastic tool for loading up sources of information. And you can interrogate the sources of information. It's not just about generating podcasts. There are all sorts of things you can do with the information that's in there and summarizing it. And I loaded up a bunch of articles from Harvard Business Review to ask it about leadership in the era of AI. And you know what? They were all talking about augmentation. They weren't talking about automation even. They were saying, oh, it's going to be augmentation rather than automation. And I'm going, no, this is, in the medium term, this is about reinvention. It's about taking a customer need, like mowing a lawn, and saying, you know what, we could motorize this, or hoovering the house. How do you fulfill the need using these tools? Not just, yes, I mean, there are great tools for augmenting humans, and we all hope we're still going to be around using those tools. But from a strategic point of view, one needs to think in terms of reinvention as well. But a lot of these, I feel, are going to come by accident, by skunk works. This thing that generates the podcasts comes out of Google Labs. Clearly in the top left-hand corner, it says experiment, like it could disappear tomorrow. And I've got a quote here, which is about almost exactly a year old, which I'd like to read out, if I may, Scott.
Please.
It's from Alyssa Rosenthal. Alyssa Rosenthal has been head of marketing OpenAI for as long as we've known about OpenAI.
Okay.
And a year ago, it was 30th of November, a year ago, she wrote this on Twitter. A year ago tonight, I got a Slack letting me know that we were silently launching, quotes, a low-key research preview in the morning and that it shouldn't impact the sales team. Then she says, happy birthday, ChatGPT. Where does innovation come from? And the thing we've been talking about comes from Google Labs. This thing just dropped out almost by accident from OpenAI. And innovation, I think, comes from the people that were experimenting on the front line using these tools to see how they can fulfill customer needs in different ways, how they can augment their own work, how they can replace their own work. And it's the first time I was on the podcast, I was talking about my book. And I think, forgive me for mentioning it, but it's called Gardeners Not Mechanics, How to Cultivate Change at Work. I think it's more relevant than ever in the AI world that we need to think like gardeners and prepare the soil for innovation and sow seeds and nurture those seeds that grow well and look promising and prune and weed when necessary. Innovation in this instance, although I agree with you, I think that leaders need to be more tech savvy. I totally agree with that. But I think that strategy in this world is much more likely to come from, go back to Tom Peters back in the day and talk about skunk works and people in basements doing interesting experiments.
Yeah. What I always say, because I think this topic can feel overwhelming for folks, a couple great places to start is if you're a leader, first of all, are you engaging in a little bit of micro-learning? So for instance, there's you subscribe to newsletters, I'm sure. There's the Neuron, which is all about AI. There's Future Loop, which is Peter Diamandis. And every day I get a little bit of a micro-learning experience, just even reading some of the headlines and better understanding oh my gosh, that's a thing. That's pretty incredible, right? We've just 3D printed our first hotel in Texas, company called Icon in Austin, Texas. So that keeps me a little bit in the loop. And so what is it that's pinging you? Stay in the loop and learn in small incremental bits. But to your point, another thing I always talk about is what's happening on the margins of your industry. Who's trying to enter the space? If you're in insurance, who's leveraging AI or leveraging some of these technologies enabling disruption to fundamentally shift and change the game? And so what's happening on those margins? Where do those people convene? And are you learning? Are you at least in those conversations and understanding how some people are thinking about the work? Because there's just a really, really wonderful opportunity there to have your ear to the ground. But if no one in the organization is engaged in that work, if no one's doing that learning, and then to your point, what are those seeds that we're planting? What are some of the small, safe to fail experiments that we're running to see if we can begin to chart a path forward and chart some opportunities? Oof, wow, it's incredible. And Gary, I mean, anything else, because we're going to start to wind down, anything else you want to just underscore for listeners as you think about what we've just put them through?
I think the remaining point is, what does it mean to lead in this world, in
Yes.
this changing context, and how do you get up on the balcony? The second point about it is thinking about what skills your people need, how you retrain and recruit.
Yes.
Because I don't have the answer, but curiosity, critical thinking, these are the sorts of things that people are going to need.
Yes.
Rather than narrow technical skills. We know that the AI we have already, and it's just going to get better, narrows the gap between high performers and less experienced performers. Let's not say less performers. So the big question is, how do you lead in this environment? And what skills do you need? What skills do your people need?
Yeah. And what you just made me think of is that the complexity is awe-inspiring. And this is one shift. There's geopolitical shifts, there's climate shifts, there's generational shifts. It's just so fascinating. So the complexity on multiple fronts is, it's incredible. And are we, to your point, hiring, training, retraining, and are we clear on how we remain agile and what that means to be a business or a person working in a business? It's in constant flux. And I just really appreciate your curiosity, because you're always pinging me, copying me on LinkedIn. I'm going to see if Scott's interested in this. And you're just the kind of quintessential explorer when it comes to this space. And I just have great respect for that, Gary. So thank you so very, very much. For listeners, yes, that first portion, completely developed, designed, integrated, 10 episodes by the AI. And then those hosts, you will notice that their names are AI and AI. That is their initials. Gary, real quick before we let you go, anything you've been listening to, reading, streaming, what's caught your attention in recent times that listeners might be interested in?
I think the best thing and it's on this subject, is that Google DeepMind have a podcast. It's also on YouTube. And Hannah Fry is a professor of maths, University College London, but she's well known in the UK as a kind of science popularizer and explainer. She even interviewed Demis Hassabis, who, if anybody's watched AlphaGo, they will know Demis from that. He's Sir Demis Hassabis now, and he is principally an AI researcher rather than a business leader. And he's probably the most level-headed thinker on AI. The whole podcast with Hannah interviewing Demis is just great. Interestingly, Demis says, in answer to the question of whether AI is overhyped, he says in the short term, yes, in the long term, it's underhyped.
Wow.
And that's really worth listening to. I think I'll leave it at that because otherwise I think our listeners will have lost them.
Well, Gary, as always, we'll do it again. Love exploring with you and love having the conversation. So thankful for our friendship, and be well, sir. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that little experiment. Kind of fascinating. The practical wisdom for me: are your eyes wide open and are you exploring the margins? That was the margins, and it's a pretty interesting place, good, bad, or ugly. It's important to be in the know, especially as strategy starts blending more and more and more with technology. That's the practical wisdom for me. As always, thank you so much for checking in. 250 episodes, pretty fun, lots of learning, and thank you so much for going on this journey. Be well. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.